Prince Memorial Evidence Competition that is sponsored by Brooklyn Law School, and the National Moot Court Competition that Mary Beth mentioned, Vanderbilt First Amendment, and helped the other teams a lot. I've also served as a regional brief judge for a couple of those competitions, which is interesting. It gives you a slightly different perspective.
Great. Thank you, Colleen. And our third distinguished guest is Professor Mike Allen. Mike Allen is a professor of law at Stetson University College of Law, and I am lucky enough to have him helping me and coaching 4 of our moot court teams. Mike?
Yes, I like to consider myself a slow antelope. I have been teaching for about 8 years. Before that, I practiced law for about 10 years up in Boston, Massachusetts. And I've been coaching moot court teams since I started. I, too, coach the National Moot Court Team and the ABA Moot Court Team. I've also done the criminal procedure competition from San Diego, as well as the inaugural Veterans Law competition this year, and also a workers' compensation moot court system down here in Florida. And I also participate as a judge in moot court practices for our many other moot court teams.
Okay, well, thank you, and welcome to our 3 panelists. As you all can see, we are going to go through a bit of a PowerPoint structure, but mainly this is going to be a question and answer. We've got a few questions, approximately 8, and we're actually going to do some interactive polls as well, so we'll get some interaction from the audience. So moving to our first question, I will direct this initially to Professor Mike Allen, and it has to do with successful moot court programs. And as you can see, it says, what constitutes a successful moot court program, and how can one help students understand what a successful moot court program or competition actually is?
Well, thanks, Steph. You know, I've come to think that the thing that can make a moot court program successful is actually keeping your eye on the overall educational mission of your school. And so the program, the moot court program, is, in my view, a success if it can be used as a tool to help students learn to be competent and ethical lawyers. And I tell my students that right up front. I tell them that it is wonderful to win at these competitions. Most people that go into any type of advocacy are competitive. They want to win. But that really it's about learning the art and skill of advocacy, and about learning substantive law, and about learning how to deal with challenges, learning how to work with others. And the successes that come at a competition are icing on a cake. And I also think that they go hand in hand. I think if you have a system that's designed to teach these type of things, and that's what you keep your eyes on, you're much more likely to be successful. And I think about this in some sense through stories, and we all have stories for those of us who've worked with moot court people. But I can think of 2 students, for example, who began rough around the edges, had problems, and by the time they left the moot court program, were really confident in their abilities, and their abilities had actually improved dramatically. You can teach students about strategy and tactics in cases. And so for me, that's what I see as the cornerstone of a successful program. It's being tied to the overall educational mission.
Thank you, Mike. And Mary Beth, did you have something to add?
I would certainly agree with everything that Mike said. I think that the opportunity to participate is really an opportunity to learn. The winning is a side benefit. And I also think my mother's an artist, and I see a lot of similarities between her winning in art shows and my students winning in moot court competitions, meaning hard to predict and hard to control. And my theory is that if they are being really successful if they win or if they are pretty close to winning. If they are eliminated in the first round, that's a concern, and I want to know, then I will look and see, were they making a good faith effort and all of that, and if they meet all of that, it happens sometimes. So I want them to be going into it certainly wanting to win, because I think that makes them perform better. But I think the learning is really the success that you get. And Mike indicated talking about ethics, I think professionalism is really something they learn. And really this is not unlike a clinic in that they are making decisions and then having to accept the consequences of the decisions they make. I give all sorts of advice, practice judges give all sorts of advice, but they have to decide what advice to take and what to do when they're on the scene in the oral argument. And of course they're making pretty much all the decisions in the competition I coach about the brief.
Great. I have just, excuse me.
Go ahead, Colleen.
Okay, yeah, I just couldn't wait to get in. This is one of the things we train students not to do. Wait until you're asked the question before you start talking. I think that something else, though, that we haven't mentioned about successful programs actually involves people who are not competing right then, and those are 1Ls and alums. I think a successful program is one that attracts and excites the 1Ls who are your future moot court team members. And I think that successful programs find ways to involve or get the 1Ls interested. For example, I use 1Ls as bailiffs at team practices and in an in-house tournament that we use in our required 2L moot court class. It's not required for the whole faculty, the whole student body, but it is required for those that want to participate in moot court. We also, our moot court board holds a competition for 1Ls every spring. We call it the Advocacy Slam, modeled on Poetry Slam, that gets them excited and gets them looking forward to being involved in moot court. But I also think that alums are important, and it's the alums who have come out of your program who are, I think you have a successful program if those people want to come back and help one day, whether that's giving their time, giving their money, or maybe both, and helping to keep the good program going and helping to improve one that you already have.
Terrific. Thank you. And I think next we are going to take a poll. So we'll go ahead and take a poll because we know that we've got a lot of people, I think, from all over the world listening in today. So our first poll question is, how long have you been coaching moot court teams?
This is Kirsten Davis just chiming in. All you have to do is click on the answer there on that quick poll you see right now, and we'll capture your answers. Thanks.
Okay. So while we're waiting for that, I will move on, and as soon as we see the quick poll results, we can have our panelists make a comment on that. But moving on, we can think about team selection until we see the quick poll results.
Steph, I think they're ready. Hang on.
They're ready. Terrific. Can everybody see them? Okay, great. So what does it look like we have here? For some reason,
I'm glad this isn't Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, because there's no definitive answer to this. Looks like we've got the gamut in our audience.
Okay, so that's good. We can, I guess, speak to all levels of individuals and keep that in mind as we move along in the presentation. We gave a lot of potential answers to that one on purpose so we could see who's brand new maybe to this and maybe some veterans out there along with us.
Steph, this is Kirsten. Are you having trouble seeing that poll?
Yeah, I don't see the poll. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, we've got 30% less than 2 years, about 27% 2 to 5 years, 17% 5 to 8, and 27% more than 8 years. So a wide range.
Wow, a very wide range. Okay, terrific. Thank you, Kirsten. And again, we can keep that in mind. It sounds like we've got a lot of brand new coaches and a lot that have been doing this for more than 8 years. So I think we'll try to talk to all levels of coaching. And we will move on to the next question, which is, how does one go about selecting students and assigning them to particular competitions? And let's go ahead and start with Colleen on this one.
I mentioned we have a required course at my school, University of Arkansas at Little Rock, that students must take if they would like to be on a national moot court team. It's an elective course otherwise, but it's the only route on the moot court. The students who complete that class successfully demonstrate that they work well as teammates, that they are good brief writers and strong oral advocates, are invited to our moot court board. Once the students are selected to the board, what we do is ask them if they are interested in being on a traveling team, what semester they would like to attend one of those competitions, who they would like to have as a partner, who they think would make a good faculty coach, and then we just pull all those things together and try to match up teams and partners. It often works well if I have a couple of students who want to work together on a particular competition. That's an easy match. Some of the others are a little bit more difficult to do, but we try to give everyone their first or second choice, and it typically works out pretty well. I think one of the more difficult things to figure out, and perhaps some of the other panelists could address this too, is the question of whether you send 2 people or 3 people to a competition. You know, how do 3-person teams work? That's always a challenge.
Yes, that's a good question. Let's go ahead and move along to Mike Allen and see what he has to say.
Yeah, I mean, team selection is so critical, just like it would be in selecting a team for litigation. And some of the things that Colleen has talked about are things that you definitely need to consider. First of all, one of the things that I think is really important is making sure that both the coaches and the students are involved in the process of selecting the teams. Not with respect to a veto or anything, but if people want to work together at the beginning for some reason, that really becomes pretty helpful. I think that an interest the student might have in a certain substantive area of the law can also be helpful, or perhaps the opposite. You know, if somebody really hates tax law, it doesn't make a lot of sense to select them for the tax law team, no matter what else is going on. And then there are other questions. The 2- and 3-person team, I think, is a great point. I have done both, and I think that I am more inclined to have make sure that if you've got a 3-person team that all students are going to argue and that you don't just have a, quote, brief writer. I know we're going to talk about brief writing later. And another issue to think about that people go back and forth on, I think, is do you want to try to have a balance in terms of always having a man and a woman on a team? I know for a while we sort of tried to do that, but after a while we concluded that that probably wasn't the best way in which to pair as at least the definitive result. So I think all of these things play in at the beginning, and you can easily forget how important that is.
Great. And Mary Beth?
We do it a little bit differently in that it is a student-run competition that picks all of the teams. We field about 10 moot court teams at Ohio State, and we have an internal competition called the Herman Competition that students run for the second years to compete in. And at the end of the competition, the students are ranked according to their performance in brief writing and oral argument, and then the students submit their requests in order for what teams they want to be on. And then they are considered by the board and the board's faculty advisor, which is not me, and the teams are put together. I think there is some consideration of, gee, would these people get along together, but there's no sort of I want to be with Mary Beth or whatever. It is done. I think the major significance is the rank. We typically, I shouldn't say typically, for the national and the ABA, there are 3-member teams. Some of the others, I think, are 2-member teams, and I totally agree with Mike. We always have each person argue. We have one who's the anchor who argues every round, but then the others switch between the two. And interesting that you mentioned the balance between men and women. We don't pay any attention to that. But one thing I pay attention to when I am helping teams decide who's going to be the anchor, I think it's good to have a variety of speaking styles. And so if you have one person who's a very sort of classic, dynamic, aggressive speaker and one person who's more quiet, I think that's a nice balance to look for on the team. As far as sort of substantive issues, one thing that, and this is a student-run competition, and those of you who deal with student-run things know that the rules change every year because the students react to whatever injustice they thought happened during the year they were competing, and they say, when I get on that board, I'm going to change that. So we often have a little change in the rules every year based on who happens to be the head of it. But one thing that I know they have done sometimes is for certain teams there is a prerequisite that the student has taken the class as the tax law or whatever class, so that you don't have someone just by virtue of the ranking writing a brief on a subject that they really have no knowledge about. So that's something that we keep in mind. I will also just add one more note quickly, which is that most of our teams are made up of 3L students, but we have a required appellate advocacy course for the entire second year class that takes place fall of second year. And we take 4 students from the creme de la creme from that class, and those who want to do it also, you aren't forced to do it, you volunteer. And so there's like the top 16 students from that class can volunteer to do it, and there's a little competition. And then we have 4 2Ls who are spread across 4 of the teams that are competing in the spring semester. And that helps give us a little institutional knowledge for the third year.
Wow, that's terrific, and some good suggestions. We've got another poll, actually, and here it is on your screens. Hopefully you can see it. Do you have a faculty advisor who helps make decisions about who competes and where? So we'll let you go ahead and do that and see if we can have some interactive polling.
That's clicking along, Stephanie. Hang on.
Terrific. No problem. And I can actually speak on behalf of Stetson. We do have a faculty advisor, and we have a wonderful, very supportive faculty and deans, which makes it much easier in the big picture when you're running the court programs. Great. Do we have any results, Kirsten?
We sure do, Stephanie. 87% say yes, 13% say no. They don't have a faculty advisor.
Wow, terrific. And if any of our panelists have any suggestions, maybe for those who don't have a faculty advisor, we'd love to hear it.
Get one.
That's probably the best advice we could receive today. Believe me.
This is Colleen. I agree with that too, because one of the things we'll be talking about a little later today is budget. And I think it's important that moot court programs have a faculty member who can be the advocate to the dean or whoever it is that's making the budgetary decisions at the law school. There are other good reasons that we'll be talking about later, that things that a faculty advisor can do. I think there's some differences between being an overall faculty advisor and being a specific coach. Like Stephanie, I have more the mother hen role, the faculty advisor at my school, but then I do then coach some specific teams. But it's nice for students to have a faculty member that will run interference with them, for them, not with them.
Agreed. Okay. Professor Allen, did you have anything to add?
Well, the only thing I'd say is I'm also in favor of having a sort of an omnibus person in charge, because Stephanie Vaughn, for example, who does it here, it's great because we have individual coaches have individual views of individual issues, but Stephanie's able to see the whole board, see the whole system, see how all the people fit together, which I think is just very important.
Okay, thanks, Mike, and thank you very much. We are going to shift gears a little bit and talk about references. This might be very helpful, especially for those of you who haven't been coaching for too long. What are some of your favorite reference works or some really good materials for moot court teams to have? And let's go ahead and start with Mary Beth on this one.
When I saw this question, I was a little intrigued, because I don't know that I give them formal reference books. I want them to be spending their time doing research for the brief. I do have, and I think this probably happens at a lot of schools, I have this cache of handouts that we give that probably gets a little bigger every year or a little longer. Oh man, the team screwed up on this last year. We better put that in the memo. So we give them sort of an internal document with reminders and that sort of thing. I really want them to really know those rules. I tell them that's their responsibility, that those are their court rules, their rules of procedure, and they want to make sure they really know those. And I recommend sort of general things, because the national competition, as those of you who coach it know, you cannot help them. And so I give them these generic recommendations before the problem arrives, like, go look to see if there's a case that is a real case that your case is obviously based on. Look at those briefs, being aware of how to do it carefully, that sort of thing. But other than, just the materials that they used in their appellate advocacy course, I don't have anything in particular that I recommend.
Okay, thank you. And what about you, Colleen?
Well, I think Mary Beth said a very important key concept here, and that is the idea that what help you give them before the problem is released. Once the problem has been released, they're not allowed to have any sort of assistance. So I think you need to be thinking ahead of time. And so I think some of it depends on what kind of training program you have, whether you have a formal course like the 2-hour class that I've mentioned that we have at my school, or whether there's some kind of training that the Moot Court Board itself offers. But I can think of a number of resources that would be useful for that kind of training prior to the competition. For one thing, I think if you've been to, when you go to a competition regularly, you're the coaches that attend year after year, you're going to have copies of the briefs that were submitted by the other competitors, and one of those briefs won Best Petitioner's Brief and one won Best Respondent's Brief. I keep those. In the old days I had to keep a stack of paper briefs, but nowadays it's wonderful because I have them in PDF format for most competitions, and we have a twin site for our Moot Court Board. We just keep them stored there. And so students who are going to enter, for example, the Prince competition can look at best briefs from years past. So that's been very helpful. Another thing that I have found that's useful just as a general matter, this is especially for your students that really don't have a strong notion of what Supreme Court advocacy is all about, would be to look at briefs from the Solicitor General's office, which are available online, oral arguments that they could listen to on the OYE website, online transcripts for oral arguments which are available from the legal publishers. Those are very useful. Some of you may have read the recent book that was written by Brian Garner and Justice Scalia, which I think for students would be interesting. I don't think there's anything earth-shattering in there, but it's an easy read, and it's very entertaining, and I think that they might enjoy that.
Agreed.
And finally, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago that I have recommended to teams since I first got my examination copy, because one thing they all struggle with is standard of review. A book published by Thomson West called Federal Court Standards of Review. It's written by Judge Harry Edwards and Linda Elliott. It's for district court decisions and agency actions, and it's not a very, it's an accessible book, but it's going to be, it really covers thoroughly the kinds of things they want. So I think that's a good thing to have in a Moot Court library also, and I highly recommend it.
Okay, thank you. And Mike?
Well, I definitely second the recommendation for the Scalia-Garner book. I think that Colleen's description of it is absolutely right, which is it's nothing earth-shattering, but it's a great, easy read for students. You can actually hear Justice Scalia's voice practically when you're reading that. And I'd have two other things. One, not to embarrass my colleague, but Stephanie Vaughn just had an article published in the Baylor Law Review, which you can think of as sort of a mini version of some of the stuff that Scalia and Garner do. And so if you don't have a lot of time to read the entire book, I think that article about the art of persuasion, is what it's called, is a great reference to have. And the last thing I'd say is something a little different. As those of us who do these competitions a lot, particularly the national and the ABA, more often than not, there's going to be a question of either statutory or constitutional interpretation somewhere involved. And I will often recommend that students read two books. They're very quick books. One is Justice Scalia, again, called A Matter of Interpretation, and the other is by Justice Breyer, called Active Liberty. And they each present a very different means of approaching statutory and constitutional interpretation. And so much of the cases that talk about that type of issue are proceeding from one viewpoint or another, even if they don't say it. And so I found those books to be really useful.
Thank you, and thank you, Mike, for that. We'll move on to another question. How do you train or encourage students to really make research and brief writing a team effort? It's easy to divide up the research and writing, as we all know, but is that the best strategy? And how do you encourage a team to produce an integrated brief that is internally consistent and that speaks with one voice? I'll stay with Mike on this one, since we were talking to Mike.
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind, and this is just my view of this, is there's no one answer to how you have to do this, because I think that what works well with one set of folks is not going to work all that well with another necessarily. And so, you know, you sort of have to take with a grain of salt any generic comments. But I do think that one thing that is important is actually to say out loud to the students at the beginning that this is a concern. Because, of course, we go through this time and time again, and we know the importance of the brief, and we know the importance of speaking with a single voice. But I'm not sure that that's actually intuitive to students. And I think that it has worked well to have, not to sound like President Obama's administration necessarily, but to have a brief writing czar, which I consider not to be the person who is responsible necessarily for doing the smoothing out, but the person who's going to be the ones that their teammates end up hating, because this is going to be their mission to do these things, to make sure that it's being done. I think if you have the right person in that role, sort of like the right quarterback, you're going to be much more likely to be able to produce this type of single reading brief.
Terrific. And Colleen?
Oh, I agree with Mike completely on that one. I think bad examples can be instructive sometimes. You know, you talk about trying to get the point across to students. I unfortunately have a few bad examples from some teams that I've worked with in the past. I haven't seen so many in a while, but there will always be other bad examples out there where you can point out to them. Again, this is going to be in that pre-competition training. Examples of where, perhaps the positions or theories taken by one author or another author were inconsistent with one another, where the style, one of the dead giveaways is where the style of the point headings or the questions presented are markedly different. These are things that I have noticed, particularly as being a brief judge, and the things that may affect the brief score. You need to really impress upon your students the effect of the brief score in their ability to advance. They can be wonderful oral advocates, but if the brief scores are lousy, they're not likely to make it out of preliminary rounds.
Okay, thank you. And Mary Beth?
Ditto, ditto, ditto. And one of the things I recommend is I work with 3-person teams, and I really want to get the benefit of all 3 heads. And so instead of looking at the questions presented and saying, you take this one, you take that one, and I will be the czar and the summary of the argument, statement of facts person, I say I want you all to research the whole thing for, sort of like a quick and dirty attack, research attack, so that they all have an idea about the whole case from the beginning. And I think that won't entirely prevent that contradictory issue, which I agree is something to watch out for, but it can help. And then once they have an idea of, well, gee, this issue is really the bigger, messier issue, then sometimes they will assign 2 people to that issue and leave 1 person with the 3rd one or whatever. It just helps them, I think, divide up the work because they have an idea about the whole case rather than just looking at the questions and dividing it. I also think that invariably if you have 3 people, there's one who's maybe going to end up with a little bit easier job, and that person can sort of have the review job. I don't know if Mike and I are agreeing or disagreeing on the czar concept, but that one sort of technique I think can help with the one voice issue is what I call reviewing particularly what I call the template items, which is anything that is noticeable easily, meaning roadmap paragraphs, topic sentences, headings, and conclusions, that to the extent those are stylistically similar, it's going to give the whole brief the veneer of similarity. That's one way to sort of work on the one voice. The other way is, and this was what Colleen alluded to earlier, review for contradictory statements about the law and the facts. And I know I've been in competitions where one side is asking to affirm, or one issue, the petitioners are asking for reversal, and the other issue they're asking for affirmance. And so they want to make sure that they are not contradicting themselves, or that they, a lot of times all they'll need to do is say, even if you would reject this argument, you should accept this one, or something like that, and so it can be cleaned up, but not if you're not looking for it.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you for those answers. And moving along, we're going to to take another poll. And it is, are your coaches professors, outside attorneys, or other students? And we'll have Kirsten put that into action, and everybody can chime in.
They're chiming in, Stephanie.
Great.
Okay, Steph, we've got our results.
Terrific.
88% say they use professors and 69% use attorneys. Obviously, that doesn't add up to 100% because they got to choose more than one answer. And
Right.
16% use students.
Wow. Okay, so there's a good number that use students. Do any of our panelists have any experience in utilizing student coaches? No?
I do not.
No.
We have used student coaches for competitions where a person may have argued in the competition, say, in the year before. They don't want to argue again, but they've gone back. And I think if it's the right person, it can be useful.
Okay, I agree. Thank you. Okay, let's continue on with the brief writing question, and that is, how can one effectively develop brief writing skills in the context of Moot Court programs given the restrictions that usually exist concerning assistance in that part of the program? And I know that this is a big concern because they cross the gambit. Some competitions allow 0 input, others actually allow quite a bit. And we'll go ahead and start with Mary Beth on this one.
This is something I've argued about with the people at the competitions to no avail. In the national competition, it's very strict, and it does have a pedagogical effect. And the only thing you can do is get them in advance if you can, and I think then you would use the same techniques you would use in a class, and Colleen alluded to these: deconstruct good and bad briefs and look at them, that sort of thing. I give them a lot of pre-brief handouts. One thing I do, since I cannot give direct input, I really try to play psychological games with them in that I have them turn the document into me, even though I can't give them any feedback, knowing that the fact that they're turning it into me means they will be thinking, what will Beasley think about this? And that is, in the old days, I used to just, you're responsible, and they would have to deliver it to the post office by the certain time. But now they have to turn the drafts to me along the way, and that's going to, by definition, make a better product. But also I hope they're thinking of me looking over their shoulder.
Absolutely. Okay, Mike Allen?
Yeah, well, I agree that for me, the problem with this is that the restrictions on discussing the brief with them, I understand why competitions do that, but it really, to me, goes against the whole pedagogical goal of the Moot Court program, if it's supposed to be a teaching tool. So, but we live in the world in which we do, and I try to use a pre-brief approach where you can talk about generic issues, and then I also try, depending upon the competition, to spend time reading their brief after and going through it with them. And you can get students really interested in that if you use it as a means to try to help them with their oral argument, even though my real goal in doing that is to actually deal with their brief writing issues as a teaching matter. It is difficult for certain competitions where the rules are not as clear. I'm thinking particularly of the ABA competition, where there is bizarre rules that sort of allow you to discuss certain things without reading anything, which I think is trying to be a little bit pregnant. So.
Okay, and Colleen, did you have anything to add?
I just agree with everything that Mike and Mary Beth has said. I think that drafts are good. I do the same thing. My students are earning academic credit for competing in this competition, and under our upper level writing rules, they have to submit drafts to the professor. So while I can't comment on those drafts until the competition is completed, I also find that helps with them stay with deadlines, and I don't have students who are rushing to write a brief in the last 2 or 3 days before it's due to the competition sponsors, which is a surefire way to write a bad brief.
Absolutely. Okay, in the interest of time, because I am getting some questions coming in, I'm going to go ahead and skip the team practices question and move on to just taking a poll, and maybe you can comment on the poll and practices and what you think is best after we get the poll results. And then we'll move on to a very important question I know at the end is about travel. So our poll is, how many practices do your teams usually hold per week? And you'll see it's 1 to 2, 3 to 4, more than 4.
And right now,
so we'll wait. Great. Thanks, Kirsten.
Okay.
Stephanie, well,
Oh, I was going to say,
Sorry.
here they are. Sorry, Colleen.
Okay.
It's pretty evenly split. 39% say 1 to 2 per week, 36% 3 to 4, and 25% 4 or more per week.
Wow, that is pretty even. Okay, Colleen, did you have something you wanted to comment
I
there?
just wanted, I don't know that it would have been difficult for me to answer that question because I really don't think in terms of the number of practices per week. That's going to depend on how much time I have between the brief filing deadline and the time that we actually go to the competition. But I do think the number of hours that you try to get your team to practice, I think it's important to have more short practices than a few marathon sessions. I think it gives the students the opportunity to digest the feedback they get in those sessions, to conduct additional research, which surprises many of them. They thought they were through researching when they turned in the brief. So I think it's better to have more short practices. At my school, my students are going to have somewhere between 18 and 24 hours of practice typically before they go to competition. 18 is the minimum. My teams usually have about 24 hours.
Great. Mike Allen?
The only thing that I'd add here is that I think you try to shoot for for the Goldilocks amount of practices, which is the just right, because I think there is a fine line between not having done enough practice and then a team that becomes over-practiced at the end. And I think that a coach needs to be very aware that different people are going to react differently, and for some you need to pull back, for others you need to thrust sort of more at the end, and that's the thing that I'm always concerned about.
Exactly. And Mary Beth, did you have anything to add?
I just want to add a little bit about practices. I don't attend all the practices. I make it the student's responsibility, and I talk about the numbers and requirements and all of that. I think it's also important to vary the kinds of practices. I do what I call theater moots with my teams, whereas the typical moot is you run through the whole 10 minutes or a half hour or whatever it is, and then at the end you give them notes. I do moots with them where I interrupt them as we go. And I say, wait a minute, and I'm the only judge there so that they are not embarrassed in front of another faculty member or attorney. And I say, wait a minute, why are you saying that? What do you mean by that answer? And so that we really can nail down answers. And really, a lot of times it's getting them to really articulate their theme or really articulate what is the main idea they want to communicate after that very common question they're expecting to get. So it really helps to sort of really isolate is this going to be a substantive practice or a theater practice. And by theater, I don't just mean the theatrical, tone of voice and that sort of thing. So I want to say vary the types. I also have cold practices where I just sit and stare at them for 15 minutes and see how they handle a cold court.
Yep. Okay, next we will move on to the traveling with the team, because I know a lot of questions have been raised about this, and then we'll get to some of the Q&A which some of our listeners have brought in. What about traveling with the teams? How important is it for you to attend? And in the parenthetical there, how do I get the dean to budget the money for me to accompany? Let's go ahead and start with Mary Beth.
I think I'm going to be combining my answer to this with the answer to the next one, because
Great.
It is, yes, it's important. And why is it important? Because of the issues that come up commonly at competitions. I think they perform better with a coach there just because they feel a little bit more responsible and on, and so I think it's important to have the coach there. But I also think there are common problems with logistics, things that if you've coached a competition many times, whether it's a competition that moves around or it's a competition that's in the same city all the time, you know what the problems are that are going to arise, and so you're able to help the team more. From silly things like hunger, when they have them back to back to back to back, and I've got to bring food, to knowing, well, if this is the timing, I know that's not enough time for getting the scores and all of that. So, you really can look at that schedule and read it in a way that a third year can't. The other thing that I see happen, and the national competition moves around every year, so very frequently we have a person running it who's never run a competition before. And so they might not know how to interpret. There's one particular rule, I should know the number by now, but I don't, that there's often confusion on. And so it really helps having a judge there, or excuse me, having a coach there who has the chutzpah and the confidence to go up and challenge it. I think a lot of students either wouldn't have the chutzpah to challenge it, or would challenge it either too timidly or too obnoxiously to be effective. I also think coaches are good for issues of pedagogy, emotion, and professionalism. How do you deal with it when you lose? How do you deal with it emotionally and professionally? After each round, we do a little postmortem, and so we learn from each round as we go along. A lot of learning opportunity, I think, is lost if the coach is not along for the trip.
Absolutely. Okay, Colleen.
Oh, I'm the cheerleader, the mom, the valet, the concierge, the arbiter, the advocate.
I love it.
All of those roles that Mary Beth just talked about. I think you need to observe, so not just so that you can help this team, but as Mary Beth mentioned, so that you acquire that institutional knowledge and can advise future teams. That's one of the things that I think helps with talking to a dean about your budget also. If you can point to the kinds of things that you specifically assisted a team with in the past to demonstrate how essential your role is.
Great. And Mike Allen.
I agree with everything that's been said. I definitely think it's important to go. I like to think of myself in terms of the team members when we go on a competition as simply being like the big stuffed animal. I'm sort of there. I am there for comfort, to do what I need to do, so that they don't have to worry about the little details that otherwise might distract them. And I think it's very important to be an advocate if things don't go quite right for them in terms of the rules. So I think that if you have the resources to do it, it's great to do.
Terrific. Okay, I've got some great questions from the audience, which I think we'll have some time to answer at least 3 or 4 of these. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Mike Allen on this one, and that is, do you have any advice for teaching the students? Let me see. I'm not able to get a full... Okay, do you have any advice for teaching the students that the competitions are inevitably subjective? So when they don't win a competition, how do you balance the learning experience of, yes, this is subjection, with, yes, the other team really is better than you? Mike?
Well, you know, what I do is I tell them that what happens is all of the preparation of the brief, and all of the work in the oral arguments, if you don't do that, you can't be in a position to succeed. If you do that, you are positioned to succeed, but that lots of things can happen. And I tell them that it is exactly like my 10 years in practice, where there are going to be things that in the abstract are unfair or weird that sometimes just happen. And the example I do to drive this home a few years ago in the National Moot Court Competition, for those of you who coach, you know, it was a problem having to do with a roller coaster and whether a regulation was a regulatory taking. We had a competition in which, Stephanie knows what I'm going to say, in which a judge kept battering one of our advocates because he did not go and visit the roller coaster. In the town of New Caledonia in the state of Old York, they don't exist. It's moot court. But she critiqued him on the fact that she said he was a bad advocate because he did not go visit the roller coaster that didn't exist. And what I tell students, you just can't control for those things. They're going to happen just like it's going to happen in practice, and that's one of the reasons why I think moot court is good, is because you experience those types of things.
Great. And Colleen, did you have anything to add for that?
No, I think Mike did a great job on that, honestly. No, I don't really have anything to add.
Okay. I have another, and Mary Beth, anything?
I am going to say, I tell them if they win, it's because of their skill, and if they lose, it's because of bad luck. So that's very simple and straightforward and honest.
It sounds like it would probably work.
I thought of something to add, and it's only it goes back to the point we made earlier. If you don't go with the team, or a faculty coach doesn't go with the team, then if the team comes back and things didn't go so well, you don't know why, and so I think that's another reason to be there, so that you can talk with them about it. There's always that suspicion, if they come back and they didn't do well, did they give it their best? They're always going to come back and talk about the bias of the judges, or the underhandedness of the other teams, and so I think you're there to be able to objectively assess why they did as well as they did, or not.
That's a great point.
And I'm glad that you actually added that point, because one of the questions that came in was, have you ever decided not to attend a competition based upon what might have occurred at that competition, and what were your reasons?
Do you want me to answer
Yes,
that?
Please. And then we'll have Mike and Mary Beth
yes,
as well.
we have. And more than one, unfortunately. One reason has been a problem with judges who were clearly biased and unprepared. Now, it may be that we were just particularly unlucky, but where it seemed to be pervasive in the competition, it made us uncomfortable about going back. But I will tell you, more commonly, if I'm trying to, we've got a team that's kind of on the fence, so we're going to go to this competition or that one, something that makes a big difference to me is how well it's run. Did we get the score sheets back at the end? Did we have to wait 2 months? These competition sponsors are good about promoting it, but they're not so good sometimes about all of the cleanup things once everybody's left and gone home. And so if I'm not getting that kind of feedback from the competition, things are badly organized. It's hard for me to get excited about going back there.
Terrific. Mary Beth?
I just wanted to add, I do national and ABA, and so we do go back to those, but I think Colleen makes a great point, and I know that some of the other competitions we've gone to, the first time we go, there's a little assessment. Was this valid? Was this a good competition to go to? And I think the points Colleen raises are really good things to evaluate. Certainly I give sort of a one-bite rule that any mistake, anybody can make a mistake. But if you're seeing these kinds of things consistently, there's no need to spend the law school's money to go to a badly run competition where the students are going to have a bad experience.
Okay. And Mike Allen, did you have anything before we moved on? I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions after this.
The only thing I'd say is I think the key about not going back to competitions is really organization. If a competition is poorly organized both before you get there and when you're there, that to me is the red flag.
Okay. And I think we've got another audience question, which I think is a good one, and we haven't hit on it specifically yet, so I will read it to you all. When you are coaching a team that will go to a specific competition but the problem has not yet been released, how often do you meet prior to the problem's release date to go over the general strategies for the competition or for the process like standard of review? Why don't we go ahead and start with you, Mike, and then we can ask Colleen and Mary Beth, and we'll see if it's time to wrap up after that. Mike?
I think it depends a little bit, again, on the structure of your team. Some are going to be much more self-motivated. If they're third years, they're going to have a little bit more experience if they've been to other competitions. But I do try to meet before the problem comes out to discuss things like that, to discuss timing of practices once the brief is turned in, to let them ask me questions. I actually think it's important to meet. I only do it once or twice generally before a problem comes out because there's not a whole lot to discuss beyond what they learn, for example, in our basic moot court class that we require them to take.
Great. Colleen?
I always meet at least once, and it's usually an hour and a half, 2-hour meeting. We will look at the kinds of things that Mike mentioned there. I can talk about my previous experiences if this is a competition that I've attended before. We can talk about, the things for them to watch for in terms of how the problems are set up, as he mentioned, standard of review and so forth. I think that's a really valuable use of time, and then the students are prepped and ready for when the problem is released.
And Stephanie, if I could just follow up that one
Sure.
second.
Sure.
If there's something special in a competition, it's good to let them know up front. And the thing I'm thinking about is in the ABA competition, getting a brief in the top half will almost always ensure that you move on to the next, to the semifinals, because your power protected in the first couple of rounds. and I stress for them the importance of the brief for that competition, because it not only counts towards the score, but I mean it sets you up to win in the first 2 rounds. So.
Yes. And Mary Beth, did you have anything to add before we ask our last question?
I think I agree with all of those things, especially stressing the significance of the brief. It's really, there's so little adrenaline compared to the adrenaline of oral argument. It's really hard to get that across. But one thing I like to talk about before the problem arrives is working with each other and respecting each other, and I can do it all hypothetically because I haven't done any work yet. Once they are working with each other, anything you say can be perceived as, oh, did someone complain about me? And so I like to sort of raise a lot of those issues before things begin.
Terrific. Okay, and this last question came in, and I think it'll be nice to basically sum it up because it's a quick question. How do you get to the best arguments the quickest? That came in from the audience. Let's go ahead and start with Mary Beth on that one. How do you coach them to get to the best arguments the quickest?
To get to the best arguments the quickest, I guess I would say this gets to structure when we're talking about how to lead. And I really spend a lot of time with them hammering out the introduction. I think that's something that you can memorize. And so I know, in fact, I just did a practice with a team spring semester that wasn't one of my teams, where we went through the practice, and I kept saying, well, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about this? And the student really felt that logically they had to begin with that before going on to the next. And so we stopped right then. It was a theater moot. We stopped right then and had a discussion about what's the difference between what you put in a brief and what you do in an oral argument. And I think a lot of students feel like they have to go through all the arguments orally that they do in writing. And so it was, I think that is how you make them get to the best one first. You pick what does the court need to hear about first in the oral is not going to be the same thing necessarily that they need to hear about first in writing.
Perfect. Mike Allen.
I actually don't think that you can get to the best arguments quickest. Now, if what we're talking about is structuring the oral argument, yes, I agree exactly with what Mary Beth said. But if what we're talking about is, at the end of the day when you show up at the competition, how do you get to that level the quickest? I actually think that it's important, the process of practicing and working through and trying out stuff to figure out what the best arguments actually are is itself so beneficial to having the students then understand the issue inside and out. So I'm not sure it actually would be a great thing to be able to get to the best argument quickest in the context of a practice, because I think you'd lose out on the understanding that you get by deciding that I don't like this argument that I've tried.
Okay, and Colleen.
I interpreted the question similarly to Mary Beth. What I was thinking, I think it's really important that the students understand something about appellate process and procedure. If they understand really what it means to ask an appellate court for a particular form of relief and understand what an appellate court can and cannot do, the quicker they can focus that. I was in an oral argument practice recently that involved asking a court to reverse an order that had granted summary judgment. The students spent all this time talking about what the law was and what the law should be, and there was no mention of summary judgment. So I think that's one of those lessons too that carries over when they go into practice one day, and that's understand what your court can do and how it does it.
Great. Well, before we pass it back to Kirsten, I want to thank our 3 panelists. This has been marvelous. I cannot believe how fast that hour went by. I know we didn't get to a lot of the questions for all of you out in the audience, and I hope that we can maybe have round 2 of this maybe next year sometime. Thanks for participating.
Yes, thank you, everyone. This is Kirsten Davis. As you sign off, please make a note that there is a short survey from us for you to fill out and give us your feedback. Any thoughts are greatly appreciated. Thank you again to all our panelists. Thank you, Stephanie Vaughn, for moderating, and thanks, everyone, for attending.